Sena, Dr. Srinivas Rao, Dr. Sebastian, Dr. Pandit Rao. Welcome to all the chairpersons. First talk by Dr. Anju Grewal. Over to Dr. Anju Grewal.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers of ISACON 2020 Kerala State Branch, especially Dr. Manjeet George, for inviting me to speak before you all on the management of an elderly male with comorbid conditions hosted to us for transurethral resection of prostate. I bring you greetings from Danan Medical College and Hospital, the place where I work at Ludhiana. In the next 20 minutes, we will look at the pertinent points that we need to evaluate during pre-anesthesia checkup. And then based on that, look at the anesthetic concerns and formulate an anesthesia technique. And we'll also dwell on the major complication of this surgical procedure, the TURP syndrome, along with other complications with the take-home message. So coming to the case scenario, a 75-year-old 90 kg male is scheduled for TURP for a long-standing benign prostatic hyperplasia of a large prostate. On a detailed history, we find that there is a well-controlled hypertension and diabetes there for the last 20 years. So is bronchial asthma, which has occasional seasonal exacerbations. The patient is, however, on a regular follow-up and treatment with his physician, and he is currently on beta blockers, aspirin, ACE inhibitors, oral hypoglycemics, bronchodilator, and steroid inhalers on a regular basis. He also gives history of smoking 5 to 10 cigarettes per day for the last 30 years, thankfully omitted for the past 6 months. He is alert with good functional status, a blood pressure of 160/80, a pulse rate of 50 per minute. Airway examination shows a dentaless patient with dentures, artificial dentures up there, which are removable, and an MPS score of 2 with normal spine. So with this information that we have gathered, an ASA grade risk stratification would be more likely to be 2 than 3 because he is well controlled for his comorbidities. Of the investigations, a complete blood count is essential as it will reveal any underlying anemia and also any underlying infection or bacteremia, which can also be delineated from a urine analysis. HbA1c will give us a control of the blood sugar that has been there in this patient for the last 3 months. Serum creatinine and electrolyte levels are important, especially on the day of surgery. The serum sodium levels should be more than 130 millimoles per liter. ECG, X-ray chest, and blood grouping should be done preferably in all of these patients, and a blood should be saved and kept ready in hand in case for a need for a blood transfusion. Other tests would be done as indicated. So what are our major concerns when we look at these patients during the pre-anesthesia evaluation? Foremost are the geriatric concerns, and these patients can at times be frail, especially the very elderly, and hence we need to evaluate the frailty scale or the amount or we need to quantify the frailty that is there. The most common way to do is to look at the activities of daily living checklist. Whereas a lot of scales are there, I believe an activities of daily living checklist is more easier and more compatible to do. We also need to look at the neurological and musculoskeletal changes that occur with age, especially the ability to lie still, the neurocognitive status preoperatively, and the degenerative changes in the vertebral column, which can not only make positioning difficult, but also an institution of the subarachnoid block difficult. Along with them, they would always have a lot of comorbid conditions, and hence a detailed evaluation of the cardiovascular and respiratory system is extremely mandatory, and we need to look at the functional status and clinical features of heart failure. Also, we need to look at clinical features which can predispose to heart failure because there is a possibility of an overt heart failure occurring in these patients during the perioperative period. Renal functions should be evaluated in case of a long-standing benign prostatic hyperplasia, which can lead to an obstructive renal insufficiency. And of course, other comorbid conditions need also to be evaluated. We need to remember that these patients are usually on polypharmacy, hence a close collaboration with the patient and his caregivers is important to not only optimize this patient, rehabilitate this patient prior to an elective surgery, but also for medication management prior to the procedure. We all need to understand that this procedure is associated with a plethora of issues and complications. Conventionally, a TURP is done using a monopolar technique, where a resectoscope is used to remove the prostatic tissue, and hence the procedure, which is done in a lithotomy position using an irrigation fluid, can actually result in a multitude of complications. Therefore, we need to pick an anesthesia technique carefully, which not only provides us good relaxation of the pelvic floor and perineum, but also helps us to not only lessen down the impact of these complications, but also to detect the complications as early as possible. To fit the bill, I believe subarachnoid block fits the bill much more easily, because it not only provides good relaxation of the pelvic floor and perineum, it allows us to monitor the level of consciousness and detect the early signs of not only TURP syndrome, but other surgical complications like capsular tears or bladder perforation. In addition, it reduces the incidence of DVT and blood loss and provides good post-op analgesia, something that is not evident with general anesthesia. However, general anesthesia is useful in a select group of patients who require ventilatory and hemodynamic support, or have contraindications or refusal to an institution of a subarachnoid block. Now that we have delineated that subarachnoid block would be an optimal anesthetic choice for these patients, what should be the level of the subarachnoid block? And hence we must know the nerve supply of not only the prostate, but also the urethra, the neck of the bladder neck, and the supply of the bladder as well. The visceral pain fibers from prostate and bladder neck are transmitted by the afferent parasympathetic nerve fibers, which are derived from the sacral segments, mainly from S2 to S4, whereas the bladder sensation is supplied by the sympathetic nerves of the hypogastric plexus, derived from the nerve roots extending inferiorly from T11 to L2. Hence, a block with a sensory level of T10 eliminates discomfort not only by bladder distension, but also obliterates the visceral pain sensation from prostate and bladder neck. We have to remember that a sensory block above T9 is to be avoided, because that can obliterate manifestation of capsular signs should perforation occur. What is the preparation and monitoring of this patient? Is it important? Yes. After a proper informed consent, it is pertinent to remember that short-acting benzodiazepines given to allay anxiety can at times lead to post-operative confusion and delirium. Hence, a better option is to have a good rapport and communication with the patient, and rather emphasize on continuation of medications like beta blockers and his inhalers, and omission of ACE inhibitors and oral hypoglycemic agents. In the OR, the patient needs vigilant monitoring in the form of pulse oximetry, a 5-lead ECG, temperature monitoring, and which is more important is that a non-invasive blood pressure monitoring should be cycled at least to 1 or 2 minutes, and not on a larger cycling modes. In our institution, we usually preload our patients to an amount of around 200 to 300 ml to take care of the fasting requirements, and some of the times these patients could be on diuretics. So a small preload of warmed normal saline is extremely important. It is pertinent to prevent hypothermia from the very preoperative period by providing them with warming blankets, giving them warm fluids, and also warming the irrigating fluids up there. A subarachnoid block, as I said, can to at least a level or sensory level of T10 using 2 ml of, or that is 10 milligram of hyperbaric bupivacaine with intrathecal fentanyl 20 to 25 micrograms provides us good dense motor and sensory block for up to 3 hours. A saddle block can also be instituted in high-risk patients. However, the surgeon needs to do continuous irrigation and not distend the bladder too much when the lower doses are used. Hypotension, if it occurs, needs to be treated with vasopressors preferably, and an intraoperative sedation should be avoided. Rather, a good communication with the patient and a good rapport would rather serve us better. If you are choosing GA, then either a spontaneously breathing technique using a supraglottic airway or a relaxant technique can be used. What is important for us to remember that titration is extremely important and paramount because they're susceptible to the hypotensive effects of induction and maintenance agents. Analgesic requirements can be met with doses of paracetamol or small incremental doses of opioids, especially short-acting fentanyl. However, we need to consider renal function, especially when choosing non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. An antimicrobial prophylaxis is a must to prevent gram-negative bacteremia during all urethral instrumentation procedures. We must, whether we are giving regional anesthesia or general anesthesia, the systolic blood pressure should be maintained near baseline, and fluids must only be used to replace blood loss, and maintenance fluids are not required as irrigation fluid is also going to be absorbed in these patients. Coming to the irrigation fluids, why do we need them? Because we need them for proper visualizations. These are the properties of an ideal solution, which are hardly met by any of the current irrigation solutions that we have. Distilled water, though fits the bill, causes hemolysis. The major implication of here being systemic absorption, and hence we look at the available crystalloid irrigating solutions. The most commonly being used is glycine 1.5%. All of them have some amount of disadvantages or problems that occur with the use of each of them. So a question arises, can we use normal saline or lactated Ringer solution, which is easily available on our shelves? If you are doing a monopolar TORP technique, then these are not to be used because they can cause dispersion of high frequency current when using a monopolar resectoscope. Ideal solutions can be used, these both can be used if we are doing a bipolar resectoscope technique or a laser prostatectomy. Now coming back to our patient, this patient was on routine monitoring, as I said, was doing very well with the new surgeon up on there. And 90 minutes into resection, suddenly we find that the patient has nausea, retching, and headache. We need to remember that this was a large prostate and the height of the irrigation fluid was also a little more than what we desired. We noticed reflex bradycardia with hypertension, which fell down in next 5 to 10 minutes to 110/60. So there was a profound fall in the blood pressure. And as we were preparing to give ondansetron and glycopyrrolate, the patient became more irritable, pulled off his mask, the saturations dropped, became tachycardic. After the glycopyrrolate went in, there was severe respiratory distress and we could not maintain his saturation. There were creps, and we suspected on auscultation, and we suspected pulmonary edema. The patient slowly became drowsy, hence was intubated and ventilated, and invasive lines were inserted. A quick ABG was sent, and which revealed a serum sodium level of 104 millimoles per liter. Surgery was terminated. We gave furosemide to counteract the pulmonary edema, and fluids were restricted. Patient was optimized and then shifted to the ICU. Now, if you look at the signs and symptoms of TORP, they basically correlate to the rapidity and the amount of volume of the irrigation fluid that is being absorbed. And hence, depending upon the kind of CNS symptoms that you see or the ECG changes you can see, you can be approximately sure of where your serum sodium levels are currently lying. What you need to understand is, are there enough red flags while you're doing a procedure that has led to this complication? So a procedure duration of more than an hour, especially in a large prostate with a slow or an inexperienced surgeon, is extremely important because a large prostate with a longer duration can also result in large blood loss also, and also a lot of complications in the form of bladder or capsular perforations, wherein large volumes of irrigation fluid can be absorbed. 10 to 30 ml of irrigation fluid is usually absorbed per minute of resection time. And hence we need to be careful not only about the duration, but also about the hydrostatic pressure, wherein the height of the irrigation bladder should be limited to less than 60 centimeters of water. And after this episode, we have limited all our urological IV set and clamped them at 60 centimeters. The IV stand heights have been clamped to 60 centimeters. Venous pressures should be kept normal. Hypovolemia and hypotension needs to be treated, and their patients need to stay at their baseline blood pressures because any of these can lead to more absorption of the irrigation. In addition, If there is a diseased prostate or a long-standing prostate, they can be vascular and therefore lead in large blood loss. And this combined with large volumes of hypotonic IV fluids given or a pre-existing hyponatremia or pulmonary edema can further tilt the balance towards TURP syndrome becoming more severe. Yes, we can prevent the TURP syndrome simply by limiting the volume of irrigation fluid, monitoring the fluid absorption, looking at keeping a track of the time, remembering that 10 to 30 ml of the fluid is being absorbed per minute of the resection time, and also limiting the height of the irrigation fluid to keep the intravesical pressure at less than 15 to 25 millimeters of mercury. What is the mechanism that underlies the TURP syndrome? We need to remember that there is concomitant hypervolemia leading to an excessive circulatory volume, which leads to ventricular failure, and transient hypertension, bradycardia, and of course, in addition to it, pulmonary edema in patients who are predisposed to pulmonary edema with cardiac conditions. In addition, there is a concomitant acute hypoosmolality and a hyponatremia, dilutional hyponatremia that occurs, both of which will contribute to a lot of CNS symptoms that you see in these patients. So it is the acuity of these events occurring along with the rapidity and the volume that is being absorbed into the systemic circulation that determines the rapidity with which the symptoms develop. In addition, there could be symptoms that develop directly because of the effects of the irrigating fluid like glycine or ammonia onto the central nervous system. In the event of a severe TURP syndrome occurring, which is more of a clinical constellation of, which is recognized by a clinical constellation of symptoms that occurs, we need to stabilize the airway, breathing, and circulation, inform the surgeon and terminate the surgery. And we need to remember that because there is a circulatory volume load, we need to stop fluids and promote furosemide. Promote diuresis by giving furosemide. Remember, furosemide can at times exacerbate hyponatremia. Hence, fluid restriction in milder cases where the serum sodium levels are more than 120, between 120 and 130, fluid restriction up to 800 ml in 4 hours is enough to achieve a sodium rise to occur. In case of severe hyponatremia, that is the serum sodium level of less than 120 millimoles per liter, or with severe symptoms like encephalopathy, etc., a correction with 3% hypertonic saline at the rate of 1 ml per kg per hour for the first 3 to 4 hours is advocated. But we need to take care to remember that at any point in time, the serum sodium is not raised beyond 5 to 10 millimoles per liter in the next 24 hours. And a close monitoring is extremely important because rapid correction can at times lead to central one-time myelinosis. If the patient has CRF, hemofiltration is advocated, and if hypertonic saline is not available, 8.4% sodium bicarbonate can also be used. Convulsions can be treated with diazepam or thiopentin, and magnesium is a good agent to use because glycine causes activation of the NMDA receptors, which is well tackled by the NMDA receptor antagonist magnesium. We instituted all these measures in our patient, and the symptoms resolved in another 24 hours, and the patient could be extubated and discharged to the ward in after 48 hours, 36 to 48 hours. A point to note here is that how is to guide use of hypertonic saline is a simple measure to calculate the total body water as 0.6 into body weight. And this total body water multiplied by 2 will give you the number of milliliters of hypertonic saline, which will raise the serum sodium level by 1 millimoles per liter. So that is the amount of ml of hypertonic saline that you will give over 1 hour to raise the serum sodium levels by 1 millimoles per liter. In addition to TURP syndrome, there are multiple complications that need to be watched and that are associated with this particular procedure. Of note is hemorrhage, myocardial ischemia, hypothermia, complications like prostatic and bladder or urethral perforations, and in the postoperative period, these could be, in addition to these, there could be bladder spasm, DVT, and postoperative cognitive impairment occurring. And we will touch on a few complications. Bladder perforation usually happens because of the damage by the cutting loop or the knife electrode during difficult resection, or because of overdistension of the bladder with irrigation fluid. Surgeons usually notice this first before us because they would notice an irregular return of the irrigating fluid. However, in an awake patient, where an extraperitoneal perforation is more common, they would complain of periumbilical, suprainguinal, or suprapubic pain or discomfort. Intraperitoneal, though far less in occurrence, is more serious, is evidenced by shoulder tip pain as complained by the patient. And therefore, an immediate laparotomy and correction of the defect would be needed if the defect is large. Hemorrhage, we need to remember that an average blood loss is around 500 ml per minute, but what is issue up here in this particular procedure is that the assessment of blood loss gets difficult. Hence, a clinical judgment and communication with surgeon, looking at the trend of vital signs, observation of the drain bucket, looking at the resection time and remembering that we are going to lose 2 to 5 ml of blood per minute of resection time would help us to gauge the amount of blood loss that can occur. Some of the centers recommend doing hemoglobin levels of returning irrigation fluid. Of course, at our place, we do serum hematocrit levels if we find that there is a large prostrate and we feel that the blood loss is anticipated to be more. In that particular case, IV tranexamic acid is a good prophylactic measure. And of course, Foley's catheter inflated with traction applied can help reduce the bleeding in these particular cases. Hypothermia and shivering is quite common in these patients, and hence IV fluids and irrigation fluids need to be warmed along with post-active air warming devices like bear huggers should be applied to these patients. There can be issues and complications occurring secondary to positioning, not only with nerve compression, but also a respiratory compromise occurring in patients who have pre-existing lung disease. So we need to be careful about these. And especially careful is the point of time where we need to keep a record or check the blood pressure at regular intervals when the legs are being lowered down from lithotomy. That's the point in time when hypovolemia may manifest as as hypotension. In the postoperative period, TURP syndrome is known to can occur again, or this is a notorious syndrome that can occur as early as say 30 minutes into the procedure to 24 hours to the procedure. After the procedure, bladder spasm is another issue that can occur because of an indwelling catheter that stimulates the bladder neck and can be treated with low-dose diazepam or benzodiazepines and hyoscine. We need to take care of pain and other issues in these patients so that there is we can avoid the development of myocardial ischemia and of course postoperative cognitive dysfunction. Just a few points about glycine toxicity. Glycine toxicity is implicated in transient blindness, and this has been seen commonly in many of the patients. We need to only reassure because this does get reverted in 12 to 24 hours. In case of delayed awakening, especially after general anesthesia, ammonia levels need to be looked into because this can lead to hyperammonemia, can at times lead to delayed. So our take-home messages are, what are these for us? We need to evaluate them thoroughly, have time to optimize them, communicate and create a rapport with the elderly patient, offer them regional anesthesia, especially spinal anesthesia, because it has several advantages over general anesthesia, especially for a conventional TURP. Employ preventive strategies for the avoidance of TURP syndrome. And if it does occur, need to treat it by stabilizing or optimizing the airway breathing and circulation with a controlled correction of hyponatremia. Intraoperative and postoperative periods therefore need vigilant monitoring and good communication with surgical team for early detection of TURP syndrome and better outcomes in this elderly group of patients. Thank you all for a patient hearing. God bless you.
Thank you, Dr. Anju. Next, we have Dr. Lakshmi Kumar. Over to Dr. Lakshmi Kumar.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My topic today is how I do it and how I normally give anesthesia for a patient with cirrhosis who comes for an incidental surgery. So, right. So we are very familiar with the kind of scenario we've seen. Some of us do take it up as an adventure, and then there are surgeons who again are equally adventurous. Sometimes we are completely unaware of the depth of the situation. So let me just present the case of a 59-year-old gentleman who had come to the Department of Urology with symptoms of malaise and hematuria. He had undergone a transurethral resection of the prostate under a spinal anesthesia 6 months earlier for a benign prostatic hyperplasia. Because of the hematuria, he underwent a flexi-ureteroscopy and a biopsy, which revealed a high-grade uroendothelial tumor rising from the right kidney and was scheduled for a light laparoscopic nephroureterectomy. His comorbidities were a known chronic liver disease for which he was under follow-up from the Department of Medical Gastroenterology. Now, I'm just showing you a CT scan of the abdomen, not actually to the tumor, but to the cuts of the lower abdomen. And if you see, the arrow points to the presence of ascites around the liver, the presence of very dilated, this is a venous phase, and you can see very dilated esophageal, gastric and esophageal varices. And then, of course, the enlarged spleen. So besides the tumor, this is what actually hit my eye when he came for surgery. So when you look on the patient from outside, it's not always evident that the patient has cirrhosis and you pick up the manifestations immediately. Is it really possible that we look at a patient and know he's cirrhotic? Not when he's child A or child B. The telltale signs, of course, could be the presence of jaundice, a low platelet count that you might see incidental with this examination, fetal edema, and ascites. So this gentleman underwent a laboratory examination, and you can see that the hemoglobin for his age appeared low, 9.9. Platelets were certainly low. The creatinine appeared normal, not very high. Electrolytes were okay. Bilirubin was normal. Albumin was 2.8, which was low. And his INR was about 4 seconds, 4.5 seconds above the control value, and was 1.43. The activated partial thromboplastin time was just a few seconds from normal. Fibrinogen levels appeared to be on the lower side. Now, on his clinical examination, it was found that he was also on a diuretic for probably ascites. And with this, we graded him as child B. Did not have encephalopathy, 0.1. Bilirubin was normal, so that's 2. Albumin was 2.8, so that's 3 points. 2 plus 3, 5. Prothrombin time, 2 points. 5 plus 2, 7. And ascites, mild and controlled with drugs, which is 9. So he comes to be a child B. And if you want to do a model for end-stage liver disease scoring, which takes into account creatinine, bilirubin, and INR, this is what we got on the online calculator. His MEL score was 16 points and an estimated 3-month mortality was 6%. Now, before we actually wonder why and how anesthesia is going to be delivered to this gentleman, briefly take you through a couple of slides on the pathophysiology in cirrhosis for us to understand why the changes that happen in cirrhosis actually take place. On the left, you see a normal hepatic architecture. And on the right, this is an enlarged version of a distorted architecture that is seen in cirrhosis. So the entire pathophysiology in cirrhosis is the destruction of the normal architecture of the hepatocytes, resulting in fibrosis and the obstruction of the venous outflow, leading to the development of portal hypertension and ascites. Right? So there's a progressive disorder where the normal hepatic parenchyma is replaced by fibrotic nodules. This is again a kind of a cartoonish diagram of the picture of a hepatocyte. But if you look at two key things, these are the normally located stellate cells with its tentacle-like structure in green, and this is a space of Dicey. So in the normal function of the stellate cells is in the elimination of endobacteria, and in the space of DISI is where the lymphatics drain and are carried away by the cisterna chyla and the lymphatic systems of the body, the normal endothelial cell structure. But see what happens in cirrhosis. The structure is altered, and these stellate cells are actually replaced by a collagen matrix that has a fibrosing effect, and the outflow of the lymphatics from the space of DISI is altered. And this is the pathophysiology for the origin of the development of ascites, right? The mechanisms of liver injury may change. I think all of us know that alcohol remains the most prevalent etiology for the development of cirrhosis in our country. And the mechanism for which alcohol produces these changes are briefly shown in the figure. Gut endothelial vasodilatation, activation of the Kupffer cells, stellate cells, and the release of numerous inflammatory markers that actually bring a destruction. So this is just a CT image where you see the fibrotic nodules that's common in cirrhosis. And so when the normal hepatic architecture is altered and replaced by fibrotic tissue, this prevents the effluent of blood, leads to the development of increased pressures within the portal system and the opening up of alternate channels of venous drainage, leading to the development of portosystemic collaterals. The drainage obstruction through the space of DISI leads to ascites, presence of portal hypertension. The normal portal pressure in the portal vein is less than 5, and more than 8, you call it the development of increased portal pressure. This predisposes to ascites. More than 12 millimeters of mercury, you get the development of esophageal varices, and when the pressure is more than 20, you can get spontaneous variceal hemorrhage. So this is what happens, and you see your patients in varying degrees of compensation when they come for elective surgery. But keep in mind that anything that goes wrong would push them into a stage of decompensation and worsening hepatic pathology. So when all patients come, there are multi-system manifestations. Do all patients have multiple system involvement? No, but the degree of involvement could be in varying degrees. It's important to remember that the cirrhotic has definite cardiovascular changes, predominant of which is a development of a hyperdynamic state. This is associated with an increased circulatory volume, increased cardiac output, decreased systemic vascular resistance, and altered the neurohormonal responses, right? So when you have too much of ascites and decrease in the sympathetic tone, a small hypotension may actually cause a vasoconstriction and compromise of blood flow to the kidney, which is why they become so very vulnerable to intraoperative blood pressure changes. So to actually talk about changes in cirrhotic cardiomyopathy, you need to look for a prolongation of the QTC interval on an ECG. You need to remember that they're chronotropically incompetent, partly because of the disease and partly because of a concurrent treatment with beta blockers. And important things you look for in an echo are, of course, an increased ejection fraction and sometimes the presence of an outflow tract gradient. But most importantly, you look for the presence of right ventricular systolic pressures, which would be a surrogate to tell you the degree of volume overload in the patient and the capacity of the heart to handle it. Coagulation is another system which is deranged in patients with cirrhosis. But remember, it's just not an overt coagulopathy, but an altered coagulation. And this is the highlight of the coagulation liver disease that has come up in the last 10 years. So remember that the same patient who may have a platelet of 60,000 may get a deep venous thrombosis. So this is because they have an altered balance between procoagulant and anticoagulant factors. While they have a low platelet, they have increased levels of von Willebrand factor, which allows platelet aggregation, and decreased levels of ADAM-TS13, which inhibits platelet clumping. Low levels of clotting factors, namely 2, 5, 7, and 10, are actually countered to some extent by elevated levels of factor 8 and low levels of the naturally occurring anticoagulants, protein C and protein S. And while you have elevated levels of a fibrinolytic pathway, the pathway, the plasminogen from which the pathway begins is decreased. So it's all a compensated state. And you need to remember, you don't correct overzealously just because you see an INR of 1.9. Of course, this is something which all of us know, that besides the static test, which is a fibrinogen, a platelet, an INR, and an APTT, these tests, which are called the viscoelastic test, so the point of care testing of coagulation, may be a better indicator of the actual coagulation. So if you have facilities for with this in your setup, it would be very good for us to know the actual coagulation, right? So as pointed in my previous figure, this is both the TEG and the ROTEM. This would actually tell you how much clotting factors are present. The alpha and the K would tell you the rate at which the clot starts to form and typically indicates low levels of fibrinogen if it's abnormal. This maximum amplitude is a combination of both platelets and fibrinogen. So if you know the fibrinogen is normal, then this is corrected by administration of platelets. And of course, if you see a spindle, you know there's fibrinolysis and you need to treat it with tranexamine. So in a patient with cirrhosis, can surgery be undertaken? So in a child A, typically a MELD that is less than 10, surgery is reasonably safe and there's a less than 20% incidence of morbidity. In a child B, such as ours, typically MELD 10 to 14, you need to use caution. Definitely understand there's a higher risk of morbidity, definitely a higher chance of bleed. And in child C, nobody does an elective surgery. So it's only emergent surgery. And if they do come for surgical indications, you actually take a decision on whether the surgery needs to be performed or if it can be managed conservatively. So what other investigations do we do? Well, besides the biochemical investigations, which of course you look at blood glucose profile, in this patient a cholesterol test was also done and you find that the cholesterol levels are abysmally low. His total cholesterol was 6, high density cholesterol 11, values that are so abnormal and which actually reflect that the capacity of the liver to synthesize cholesterol has gone. So this is a dangerous customer. ECG, as I said, you look for arrhythmias and QT prolongation on an echo, RVSP, ejection fraction, and rarely for the presence of LVOT obstruction. So if you see an LVOT obstruction, there's nothing to panic. Usually the addition of a beta blocker corrects it very comfortably and you can manage provided it's not a very high value. A PFT was done for our patient. And as expected and intuitively, you see a restricted pattern because of the presence of ascites. Some of these patients may also have a pleural effusion. So when this patient comes for anesthesia, what are the principles of anesthesia that I wish to incorporate in our patient? Now, basically, it typically begins with a pre-anesthesia checkup. I would like to continue the drugs that he was already taking so that I don't distort his basic equilibrium, even if it were a diuretic. Of course, pre-medication is avoided because the effect of pre-medicants on these people is unpredictable. And you don't want to push them into a hepatic encephalopathy because you've added a sedative on the previous day. As I've said, although they are coagulopathic, they have an altered coagulation. Therefore, you use mechanical compression devices or TET stockings, right? You may not want to give them a low molecular weight heparin, even if it's a laparoscopic surgery, but beware that they can be predisposed to deep vein thrombosis in a prolonged laparoscopic surgery. Now, we all know patients with cirrhosis have a delayed gastric emptying. Do we go ahead with a blanket order of 8 hours in the NPO for solids and 2 hours for clear liquids, or do we need to exert more caution? Things are not so bad even for cirrhotics. Like this, on the left, you actually see the picture of a patient with ascites with end-stage liver disease. And the right, you see a picture of his gastric antrum on an ultrasound, which doesn't shows very minimal fluid. 9 out of 10 patients will probably have nothing through their Ryle's tube when you aspirate them. But of course, this is not to throw caution to the winds. You need to be careful, but you can use your discretion looking at the patient's ascites and probably the history. Those who are inclined to give small amounts of any clear fluid can give the 12% maltodextrin or the Carbolo. This is usually given as 400 ml volume 2 hours before surgery and 800 ml on the night before. You could probably cut down the night before and reduce the 400 ml to 200 ml given 2 to 3 hours before the surgery. Most patients tolerate it quite well. Right. So regarding arrangement of blood and products, when taking the patient, you need to anticipate a peroperative bleed. This patient had an arrangement for 6 units of Paxils, 4 units of FFP, 1 unit STP, and 10 units trial. So in the management of anesthesia, a lot of this has been said about how the drugs and inhalation agents affect hepatic blood flow. Most commonly, with a careful anesthetist and maintenance of mean arterial pressures, you don't see a kind of hepatic injury that is induced by either an inhalational agent or your induction. Remember that, of course, Halothane, which is probably the only drug that might affect compensatory hepatic arterial flow, is no longer being used. We now have the privilege of using better agents like sevoflurane and desflurane and isoflurane. So iso, sevo, des are in increasing order of safety. You always need to maintain a mean arterial pressure, and I would strongly urge you to consider starting a dose of norepinephrine to ensure that the mean arterial pressure does not fall low and that the urine output is maintained almost all the time. Intraoperatively, the gamut of drugs that we have are pretty good. So, among the induction agent, propofol is superior to thiopentone, which has a redistribution. Propofol has a short half-life, reasonably safe. But if you were to believe that your patient had some element of myocardial dysfunction or cardiomyopathy, you could move on to etomidate. And inhalation agents, it's either iso, sevo, or desflurane, whatever you have. Probably sevo or iso is a reasonable choice. And among narcotics, either fentanyl, and of course, remifentanil is not available. If it is, then that would be a better choice than fentanyl. Choice of relaxants for intubation, if you want to use a rapid sequence, rocuronium or even scoline is a reasonable choice, although technically scoline may have a prolonged duration of action because of deficiency of the enzyme pseudocholinesterase. And subsequently, you can give either cisatracurium or atracurium depending upon availability. Both are reasonably safe. Of course, an epidural becomes contraindicated, and more so in the background of a lapse surgery. So the alternate to the epidural is, of course, the use of transverse abdominal spleen blocks. Even IV lidocaine has been used in lapse surgery. I'm just coming to that. So remember, it's a multimodal plan of anesthesia. NSAIDs are avoided. You definitely need to titrate drugs. And if you have a BIS or a neuromuscular junction monitoring, it makes your anesthesia so much better, right? Of course, the availability is a question. You don't poke a needle into the back in any patient who's child C and patients who are in child B, except those rare instances of a child B patient coming for, say, a TURP and who has other comorbidities. And a single needle, perhaps under the cover of IVF plasma, may be acceptable, but it's completely on the experience and the discretion of the anesthetist and cannot be written as a dictum in a book. Right? These are some of the pictures. On the left, you see a subcostal tab block. Perhaps this patient received a subcostal tab block and a lower ilioinguinal block. I don't remember. Now, while I have said that IV lidocaine can be used in lapse surgery, remember that its use in a patient with end-stage liver disease needs to be under supervision because the metabolism of lidocaine is in the liver, and when liver function is compromised, you have a higher chance of potential toxicity. So I put it up in the slide, but be cautious. So these are various blocks that one might use, and it would completely depend upon the site of the incision. Here, mostly you will find the ports for a laparoscopic nephrouretrectomy are on the subcostal plane, and the retrieval incision may be in the lower ilioinguinal area. So you can choose which block is most appropriate depending upon your surgeon's port site and retrieval incision. Ventilatory strategies during surgery, we use an air-oxygen mixture. We try to use a low-flow anesthesia to conserve inhalational agent. And by the textbook and also by our personal experience, we find that instead of using a conventional volume or a pressure control mode, the more modern dual modes like a pressure regulated volume control are superior because they actually provide that degree of change automatically. When the surgeon increases the inflation pressure or stops, you don't need to do too much. The ventilator adjusts to most of the time and your intervention is decreased. So perhaps if that mode were available on your workstation, it would be a reasonable choice. Among the use of IV fluids, I think most centers have the availability of plasma light or Cabilite, whatever is available. The reason being that it is most close to the plasma amongst its constituents, does not contain lactate as a base. It contains acetate, which has non-hepatic sources for metabolism. There's also an addition of gluconate, which does not add to the alkalinity of the solution. And the metabolism of acetate and the administration of lactate as a ringer lactate can confound the serum. Measurement of serum lactate is a marker of tissue perfusion. So these are the advantages. Probably the crystalloid I would use for this patient would be plasma light or Cabilite. Would I use a colloid in a child B? There are centers which use starch or gelatin. Gelatin particularly is being used in UK and some centers in India. This again depends upon your own comfort. We, as a rule, do not use any colloid other than albumin in patients with advanced cirrhosis, or we use products as is needed because we believe they tend to go into coagulopathy after the surgery. Right? So this is the intraoperative anesthesia chart for this particular patient. I can see that 2RL was given and probably the anesthetist changed his mind, went back to Cabilite. There are 2 units of fresh frozen plasma and 2 units of Paxil and 1 albumin that has been given. And if you actually look at the blood gas profile, which they very neatly documented, this has been pretty good for this patient, and he's been comfortably extubated at the end of the surgery. Atracurium was used, etomidate for induction, and 200 micrograms of fentanyl. I don't see a mention of blocks. Perhaps it was given, or perhaps they did a wound site infiltration. So I wish to conclude my little lecture here, that this is how I would do a management of a cirrhotic coming for incidental surgery, with the remark that incidental surgery for cirrhotics is actually increasing. The multi-systemic manifestations of CLD must be understood and corrective measures should be planned before surgery. The availability of newer advanced monitors have increased the margin of safety. Availability of an expertise with ultrasound has improved safety both with vascular access and blocks. That's something I didn't mention. This patient most certainly would have had an intra-arterial access and a central line, because you do need to keep your vasopressors inotropes, and you would like to have both an arterial pressure monitoring as well as sampling for any metabolic abnormalities. And the availability of multidisciplinary care perhaps improves the outcomes in these patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lakshmi Kumar. Now we have a discussion of 5 minutes. Over to chairpersons.
Good morning, all of you. Am I audible? Hello?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I am Dr. Ganesh Prabhu. Congratulations to both the speakers, Dr. Anju and Dr. Lakshmi, for their extensive deliberations. Actually, it's very interesting topics, very practical topics. Before I go into the audience, I want to ask some doubts to Dr. Anju and Dr. Lakshmi. Dr. Anju,
Yes.
you said when there is symptoms develop regarding the TERP syndrome, you ask the surgeon to stop the surgery. I could see one slide.
Yes, sir.
Suppose if it is bleeding, there is a spurt of bleeding. If the TERP symptom develops, will you ask the surgeon to stop the surgery, or will you ask the surgeon to seal the bleeding point?
It is but obvious that if there is bleeding, we will ask them to secure hemostasis, because bleeding is definitely going to increase the amount of irrigation fluid going in. Hence, it is imperative that before he stops the surgery, he ensures good hemostasis and then comes out. Yeah.
So you will ask the surgeon to catch the bleeding point and then close the surgery.
Yes, yes.
And what is the first
No
symptom?
further resection. Yeah.
Yes. What is the first symptom? TERP syndrome. What is the first symptom to develop, and what is our first management?
So usually, as I said, patients would at times complain of some nausea, and you would, if you're vigilant enough, you would see a transient hypertension with reflex bradycardia coming in. These would be the initial symptoms, and if you're talking to your patient, you kind of pick them up pretty early.
Okay. How will you calculate the blood loss regarding the bucket of full of water, irrigating fluid mixed with the blood? What is a simple calculation you will go for to assess the blood loss?
Yeah, I think I talked about it. We usually do, some of the centers do a hemoglobin levels of the returning fluid that comes in. Yeah. And that is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is to have serial hematocrit levels going in if you're anticipating large blood losses and you feel that the blood losses are more. And of course, your resection time. So you need to look at your resection time. So somewhere around 2 to 5 ml per minute is the amount of blood loss that would occur. But we need to be looking at the returning fluid, the color, and if possible, do a hemoglobin level of that.
Okay, thank you, madam. And one more doubt for regarding Dr. Lakshmi. Madam,
Yes, yes, sir.
it's a very simple question, madam. The patient with a cirrhosis patient, known cirrhosis patient, coming for obstructive inguinal hernia. Okay. If his coagulation profile is normal, whether he will go for general anesthesia or regional anesthesia.
Actually, if he is in end-stage liver disease, his coagulation will not be normal. And even if you see something which you think is normal, perhaps it just takes very little to derange it. So it depends upon the child stage, as I've said. But we usually these people come with umbilical hernia, and this umbilical hernia has been done very comfortably using rectus sheath blocks,
Yes.
provided the bowel is not involved. Inguinal hernias are a little more difficult to handle with blocks, but if it does not contain bowel or it is not strangulated, you can manage with a regional block supplemented with some form of sedation so that you don't go into the gamut of full GA, which can decompensate them.
So you want to avoid the regional anesthesia, either epidural or spinal. Huh?
Neuraxial blockade is off. If your child see 100% off, child be under very careful scrutiny by the anesthetist. Blocks are coming up, and I think for umbilical hernias, which is by far the most common presentation of hernias in end-stage liver disease, rectus sheath block is a wonderful option.
Okay. Thank you, madam.
Thank
Over to other chairpersons, please. Sir, other chairpersons?
I am
Please,
Dr.
sure.
Srinivas Rao.
Excuse
Am
me,
I
sir.
audible, sir?
Yes, yes.
Sir, first of all, congrats both
Sorry
Dr.
to-
Anju Madam and Dr. Lakshmi
interrupt.
Madam. A good academic feast because both are looking very simple, but it's very difficult to manage, especially anesthetic management. And especially Dr. Lakshmi Madam topic is very nice. And thank you, Madam. And once again, congratulations to ISA Kerala for giving
Excuse me, sir. Thank you, sir. With the interest of time, we have to wind up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the speakers and all the audience. Thank you.